Hey, and good morning to you once again, my brothers and sisters at Living Hope Community Church, Iglesia Esperanza Viviente, and to my brothers and sisters all throughout the world that watch these studies. We're just grateful to be together again to look into His Word. And today we're going to stay in Luke chapter 6. We're looking at the 12 apostles. I'll remind you again of what we studied last week. If you remember, Jesus prays all night. And at the end of that session in the morning, he gets up and it says, when day came, he called his disciples. Now, disciples here you would call learners, people that are viewing Jesus as their teacher, even their rabbi, although he didn't have the credential from Judaism. He did have the credential in the sense that he is God himself. And so he is the teacher, and some people are following him. In fact, many people are following him and being his disciples, his pupils. They're learning from him. But in Luke 6, we see that he separates 12 people to be apostles. And we talked about this earlier when we studied this verse. But now he is going to transition to 12 main people. He chose the 12, and he calls them apostles, people that are sent out, is the basic thrust of the idea in the word apostles. So now we get a list. Verse 14, Simon, who he named Peter, and we studied Simon last time fairly extensively, Andrew his brother, James and John, Philip and Bartholomew. Notice in these lists, and we'll talk about this a little more today, Peter is always listed first when the 12 are listed. That signifies that he's the leader of the 12. And Matthew and Thomas and James the son of Alphaeus and Simon who was called the Zealot, and Judas the son of James, and Judas Iscariot, who became a traitor. In these lists, when you see Judas named Judas Iscariot, you'll see that he's almost always identified further as the traitor. As we go through these 12 guys, we'll get to him last. A fascinating study for sure. So let's look at these 12 guys. We talked about why 12. They correspond to the 12 tribes of Israel. We talked about how their eternal future is going to be forevermore. They'll be inscribed in the new temple on the pillars. They're 12 guys that are going to be part of our worship of the Lord forevermore. But I want you to see that in the Gospels and in the book of Acts, when these 12 guys are listed, they're always listed in a similar fashion. First, you can find these lists in Matthew 10, Mark 3, Luke 6, and Acts 1, if you want to follow along there. But the first group that's always named seems to be these four guys, Peter, Andrew, James, and John. All right? The second list is going to be Philip, Bartholomew, Matthew, and Thomas. These, in the second list, they seem to still be tremendously useful to the Lord, but they don't have quite the intimacy of the first group. The first group you see separated out in many occasions where they will participate with Jesus in certain events that the other 8, and sometimes the other 9, Andrew isn't listed every time in this first group, they get special access to what Jesus is doing. We'll see that more in a minute. And the fourth group, James the son of Alphaeus, Simon the Zealot, Judas, son of James, he is called Thaddeus. I want you to see that. I think it's because the writers of the New Testament knew the stigma of the name Judas by the time they were writing their Gospels. And so when they wrote about the 12, some of the Gospel writers call him Thaddeus instead of Judas. And then the 12th one is Judas Iscariot. Again, he's always noted as the betrayer in these lists. So let's go to Andrew, and let's try to break down a little bit about what we know of Andrew, okay? Remember that Andrew's the one that first found Jesus, the Messiah, and first found Jesus and then brought his brother, Simon Peter, to Jesus. He first found his own brother Simon and said to him, "We have found the Messiah," which means Christ. Andrew is a guy that immediately recognizes Jesus for who he is. He's a guy that believes almost instantaneously as he meets Jesus and sees Jesus. He brings Simon, his brother. You recall they're both fishermen. They're both from Bethsaida. Now, Philip was from Bethsaida, the city of Andrew and Peter. So in this Galilee region, Jesus is calling ordinary guys to work. But just to show you the groupings that we just discussed a second ago, look at Mark 13. And as he sat on the Mount of Olives opposite the temple, Peter and James and John and Andrew asked him privately. Here we see the first grouping of 4 guys having a private meeting with Jesus. As you go through the Gospels, you'll see other instances where they have special access. While walking by the Sea of Galilee, he saw 2 brothers, Simon, who's called Peter, and Andrew, his brother, casting a net into the sea, for they were fishermen. We reviewed this last time. Andrew is a fisherman. Peter is his brother. They're in business together. They're likely in business with James and John as well. Jesus picks ordinary people. Jesus isn't picking Rhodes Scholars. He's not picking great marketing experts. He's not picking guys that are great at advertising or public speaking or have a leadership role. He's picking common, everyday, ordinary people, but he's transforming them. You remember what he says to these fishermen. He says, "Follow me, I'm going to make you into fishers of men." Jesus has the capacity, no matter how ordinary we might be, to transform us if we simply believe and obey. He transforms us, and then he uses us for his glory through his power. Excellent thing to understand, because you and I, sometimes we feel underqualified. We're not capable of representing Jesus, or we might feel insecure, or we don't have the confidence we might need. We just have to understand that our strength relies in the Lord. It doesn't rely in our own efforts or our own skills. It relies in the power that Jesus demonstrates through us to bring us to a place of usefulness for his kingdom. This is something Andrew experiences. Now, you don't find a gospel written by Andrew. You don't find an epistle written by Andrew. You don't really even see Andrew involved too much in the book of Acts in terms of his capacity to lead the church, but yet Jesus has singled him out to be in this first group of apostles to follow him and to have special access. Here's an example. One of his disciples, Andrew, Simon Peter's brother, said to him, "There's a boy here who has 5 barley loaves and 2 fish, but what are they for so many?" Andrew is bringing the problem to Jesus before Jesus feeds the 5,000 in the Gospel of John. Andrew's aware of what needs to be done. He doesn't express doubt. He just expresses the fact that in the natural, there's no way that these 5,000 men plus women and children are going to be fed by the 5 loaves of barley and the 2 fish. Jesus does the miracle. Andrew, I'm sure, is amazed like everyone else. But Andrew's involved. We see that here. Here's another verse. Philip went out and told Andrew. This is a verse in John 12 where Gentiles are seeking an audience with Jesus. So they ask Philip. Philip goes and tells Andrew. Andrew and Philip go and tell Jesus. So Andrew does play a role in facilitating the ministry. In fact, that might be a good name for him, the facilitator. He seems to be present in a lot of these scenarios. He seems to be willing to do what's necessary. So let's move to James and talk about him a little bit. Now, you have to be a little careful when you read the New Testament and you read the name James. Why? Well, because there's this James, the son of Zebedee, the brother of John, who becomes an apostle. Okay, but there's also James, the half-brother of Jesus. I say half-brother because James was physically born through the union of Joseph and Mary. That James turns out to be a prime leader in the early church. He writes the book of James. He has a great influence over the church at the Jerusalem Council in Acts 15. He's a leader in the Jerusalem church. Okay, so that's the second James. And you remember from the list we just went over, there's also James, son of Alphaeus, which we know a little less about, but nonetheless, today we're going to look at the Apostle James, the one who's called an apostle in Luke 6. What do we know about him? Well, here we go. As Jesus is calling his disciples, he saw two other brothers. This is after he saw Simon and Andrew, James the son of Zebedee, and John his brother. Normally, James is listed before John in these lists. It may mean that James is the older brother of John. James the son of Zebedee and John his brother in the boat with Zebedee their father, mending their nets, and he called them. We know that James and John both dropped everything to follow Jesus. But we see this special access that James has in Matthew 17. Watch this. After 6 days, Jesus took with him Peter and James and John his brother and led them up a high mountain by themselves. This is taking them to the transfiguration. You can read it in Matthew 17, where Jesus all of a sudden displays his heavenly glory before them. He's transfigured before them. Elijah and Moses are there, and they're witnessing the power of the Son of God. Peter kind of doesn't know what to do, so he offers to build tents for them, and it's a very special moment for them to see the curtain open a little bit, to see the glory of Jesus. James is a part of that. He's brought into that. Jesus specifically names him for that, and notice that Andrew isn't present in that circumstance. We also see here James the son of Zebedee and John the brother of James. Jesus gives these guys a special name, to whom he gave the name Boanerges, that is, sons of thunder. Jesus calls these two guys, James and John, sons of thunder. Now, why would he do that? Well, maybe they're just really boisterous guys. Maybe they have super self-confidence and they're very aggressive in their daily interactions with people. Maybe they're just loud. Why are they called sons of thunder? Well, let's look a little bit more at James, and maybe we'll get a clue or two. Again, we see in Mark 5, in the healing of Jairus' daughter, that Jesus allows no one to follow him except Peter, James, and John, the brother of James. So we see that, again, James is part of the top 3 in the group of the top 4, and he gets special access. But watch this at 10:35 in Mark. And James and John, the sons of Zebedee, came up to Jesus, and they said to him, "Teacher, we want you to do for us whatever we ask of you." And he said to them, "Well, what do you want me to do for you?" And they said to him, "Grant us to sit one on your right hand and one on your left in your glory." Well, there's nothing shy about that, is there? Hey, Jesus, we want to be on your right and left. We believe you're going to, usher in the kingdom of God officially, and we want to be right next to you. Well, Jesus, of course, tells them that it's not his to grant. He asked them in that occasion if they're willing to receive the baptism that he's going to receive. But here we see an example of how James has some moxie to him. He's willing to go to Jesus and confront him about his future leadership role. In Mark 14 we read, "And he took with him Peter, James, and John and began to be greatly distressed." Again, here we see James set aside specifically to go with Jesus to the Garden of Gethsemane, singled out these 3, Peter, James, and John. Again, what happened to Andrew as being one of the 4 in the top 3 list? Well, we don't know. He's not mentioned, but James certainly is. But I want you to see something profound as we continue with James for a second. Luke 9, "And when his disciples James and John saw it, they said, 'Lord, do you want us to tell fire to come down from heaven and consume them?'" James and John, they have some enthusiasm to their ministry. Jesus is being rejected by some people in Samaria, and James and John are so supernaturally involved, they're ready to call fire down, do a little Sodom and Gomorrah thing for these people that are rejecting the Lord. Of course, Jesus rebukes them, but you see again the brashness of James, the great enthusiasm he has. But then we see something really profound. Acts chapter 12. Now, Peter, James, and John. He's been to the transfiguration. He's been to the raising of Jairus' daughter. He's been in on exclusive conversations with Jesus where some of the disciples or apostles were left out. I mean, he's been fully trained, fully prepared to go forward as an apostle of Jesus and spread the good news of Jesus Christ. But look what Acts chapter 12 tells us. About that time, Herod the king laid violent hands on some who belonged to the church. Now, this is one verse, verse 2. This is all James gets. Watch this. He killed James, the brother of John, with the sword. Period. End of story. See you later, James. We know you've been trained. We know you've had exclusive access to Jesus beyond most of the apostles. And still, in one verse, you're martyred. You're dead. James is the first martyr of the disciples recorded in the early church here in the 12th chapter of Acts. This is really a contrast if you read the 12th chapter of Acts, because Peter is arrested as well as James, but instead of being run through with the sword like James is, Peter gets a heavenly jailbreak. You can read that in Acts chapter 12 for yourself. But just note that God not only chooses ordinary people and he trains ordinary people, but his purpose is served by ordinary people. James's purpose was to be trained and to serve all the way to Acts chapter 12, but then to die by the sword, to honor the Lord through martyrdom. You and I don't know how Jesus will use our lives or what he will prioritize for us, but it's very important to understand that whatever he chooses for us is the right thing. We submit to him. Again, we'll go to Mark 10 just as we get ready to close here. And they said to him, "We are able." Jesus said to them, "The cup that I drink, you will drink, and the baptism with which I am baptized, you will be baptized." When Jesus utters these words in Mark 10, he's responding to James and John's request to be on his left and right in his kingdom. He tells them, you're going to be baptized with this just like I am. And here we see in Acts 12, that's exactly right. James suffers martyrdom at the hands of King Herod. Well, that gives us a beginning. We're going to move into the study of the Apostle John tomorrow. We're going to cover this first group of 4 pretty extensively, and then we'll spend a little less time on the next 2 groups of 4 as we go through all 12. But I trust you're seeing one thing for sure. God has no problem transforming any one of us to use us greatly for his kingdom if we'll simply surrender our lives to him, obey him, and follow him. He will give us the power to accomplish his mission for our lives. I pray God blesses you with that today, church. Serve him well.